This is the Jedburgh podcast. I'm the host, Fran Racioppi. Each episode, I speak with transformative leaders, visionaries, drivers of change, and those dedicated to winning, no matter the challenge. The Jedburgh podcast is founded in the lineage of the Special Operations Jedburgh teams of the past and is sponsored by Talent War Group, an executive search and talent advisory. Visit talentwargroup.com for more. A percentage of all proceeds is dedicated to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation. This episode is brought to you by Analytics. As owners of small to medium-sized businesses, we face tons of challenges in our companies. Imagine if our only role as owners was to focus on growing our business, not on all the other stuff that needs to get done. Analytics specializes in helping businesses succeed by doing just that, managing everything else. Analytics provides a deep bench of solutions to handle the most complex challenges in finance and accounting, IT, data management, AV, and healthcare. Around these services, they wrap Insight 360, a cloud-based portal that houses your company's financial and operational information. Insight 360 develops customized reports showing key metrics, benchmarks, and KPIs for better insight into your business's performance. Visit analytics.com for more information. That's ANALYTIX.com. Recent events like the death of George Floyd and Breana Taylor have sparked race conversations, racial tensions, movements like Black Lives Matter, and corporate action. Most importantly, these events have forced us to look inward and challenge our thoughts, our perspectives, our views on race, and the role race plays in our conscious and unconscious bias. In this episode, I'm joined by investigative journalist Dax-Devlon Ross to discuss his new book, Letters to My White Male Friends. Race is an uncomfortable conversation, and this was an uncomfortable book to read. But if we ever expect to make concrete change and move forward together, this is a book we have to read. It's a conversation we have to have, and it's an action we have to take as individuals, as organizations, and as a society. So, Dax and I break down the race divide between black and white. We tie our 9 characteristics of elite performance into his 7 core beliefs: bravery, community, history, honesty, humility, inquiry, and story. We define and analyze present-day examples of systemic racism and why they exist. Dax shares his personal experiences of growing up in Washington, D.C. We lay out his lens framework for how we move forward together. And in a section I call Dax's Decision Points, he lays out his checklist for solving any complex issue. Dax, welcome to the Jedburgh podcast.
Fran, thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be here, be part of this conversation with you.
I want to open this conversation with the caveat that this is a difficult and uncomfortable conversation. The topic of race, the social divide, the tension that lives between black and white in our country today, it's as wide and it's as deep as it's ever been. Events like George Floyd, Breana Taylor, they've ignited this discussion on race, diversity, equity, and inclusion that has led to everything from constructive conversations to corporate change to outright violence. My passion, as you know, is telling the stories of those that drive change. This was a topic that I could not pass up. It's a topic that I believe we had to tell here on the Jedburgh podcast, because change, as you've talked about in your book, it's messy. It's not easy. Transformation of ourselves, our teams, our organizations, it's not always clean. In fact, I would say most often it's ugly, it's personal, it's difficult, and it's just hard. And too many people, they put it in the too hard box and they don't talk about it. They don't want to address it. But real transformative leaders, agents of change, those who are dedicated to winning no matter the challenge, the stories we tell, are leaders who get in the weeds. They get their hands dirty. They lead from the front because you cannot lead from behind. You cannot lead through talking about it. You have to lead by doing. So I boarded the plane. I came down here from New York City to Washington, D.C., because this was a conversation that I would only have with you in person. To sit across from one of the leaders in the advancement of social justice and civil rights is truly an honor. You have termed your work discerning, deep, disruptive. Having read your book, Letters to My White Male Friends, I assure you that you have succeeded in becoming discerning, deep, and disruptive. It is a pleasure to sit across from you. I see you as a like-minded partner, and I am excited to have this conversation about power over purpose, cover over comfort. So thank you for joining me today.
Man, don't know if I've had quite that kind of introduction in a long time. And I just want to, for your audience, whoever's listening, you did come down here to meet with me. Sight unseen, book perhaps read, but sight unseen. And that just means a lot. It says a lot about your integrity and what you're up to and how serious you are about the work that you're doing. So let's get into it.
All right. Well, you wrote your book for me, or people who on the surface look and may feel like me. White, male, 40, educated. I grew up in a suburban town where we bussed the Black students in from Metro Boston every morning. And then in the afternoon, we bussed them home. My Black friends growing up numbered on one hand, 1 to 5. I can name them all today.
Mm-hmm.
You wrote in the book, quote, "I write the letters herein to my white male friends because you are everyone's target but no one's focus. You and I both know that you hold immense power, wealth, and status in our society. That power strikes fear and invokes intimidation. It instills a sense of incontestable authority and certainty. Consequently, no one ever speaks to you directly. No one challenges you to push beyond your comfort zones. In short, when it comes to conversations about race, white men are typically coddled and appeased," unquote. There's no coddling in this book, Dax. There's no appeasement. And I would say often there are few, if any, punches held. It's very direct. And I appreciated that about this book. So why did you jump into this? Why are you looking at this problem and saying, I had to be the one to take a stand to jump in and have this conversation?
Man, if you'd asked me 2 years ago, 18 months ago, I had no real intention for this to be a conversation that I would be someone who's in the center of or helping to drive in some way, shape, or form. I think that's the beauty of understanding when you're called in to do something versus forcing something on other people. I felt as though I was, and I always tell the story, it was, just the days after George Floyd's murder, and I sat down to write a letter to my friends, my close friends, without really thinking of it as something other than just a way to kind of express some of what I was experiencing in hopes that they could begin to maybe approach these problems a little bit from a different perspective. Because as I've said many times, I felt as though the care and concern that people were expressing was genuine and authentic, but it wasn't really sitting with and helping and engaging with how, as my white friends, how they are seeing and experiencing this, separate and apart from me as a Black person. And I always say, this isn't just happening to me. This is happening to you too. This is happening in your country as well. This is affecting your life in ways maybe that you aren't consciously aware of, but it is having an impact. Even if that impact is you feel uncomfortable having a conversation about it, that's an impact. So in many ways, that inspiration was, with a motivation behind the book, was a letter that then became a sort of bellwether. A number of folks felt connected to it, felt like they had been invited into a conversation at a time when they didn't feel like there was much out there giving them an anchor and a way to push forward. And I think lastly, as I've said more recently, I think for a long time, I didn't fully sort of appreciate the extent of my relationships across race, and how different that was from some other people's experiences. I grew up in a city and I grew up in a time that was, in DC, was very integrated in my environment. So I look at my soccer team pictures and I'm like, we were probably 60-40 white, Black, and there were some biracial kids. So I say all that to say that my authentic experience from the time I was a young person all the way to the point in my life now in my 40s has always been weaving through and around and deeply intertwined with race. And it's very much an intimate relationship and friendship with white men, as well as my Black friends, my Latinx friends, my Asian friends. But I don't think that I ever considered that proximity and that authentic relationship might have given me some credibility and maybe even some language to drive a more intentional conversation at a point in time we needed to have one.
Well, I want to ask about those early days because I think they're really important. You admittedly came from a well-off family in D.C. You went to one of the best schools in the D.C. area, in the country, growing up. You went to a great college. You earned a law degree. And you said that, quote, "the white people that I knew lived in our neighborhood," unquote. You also said, "I was not ducking bullets or dodging drug dealers. I never had to worry about food or where I would live. We took family vacations to Martha's Vineyard in Jamaica. unquote. This background, though, lit a fire in you. And what you talked about, bridging this gap, weaving through, also made you more attuned to systemic racism. And so I'm hoping what you might be able to do is define for me systemic racism, but then also talk about how this upbringing shaped your views and actually made you more aware of it.
Yeah, it's funny. There's this level of, I resist the idea that I was well off. I embrace the idea that I was, based on my father's income, middle class, because I did not come from, my father was the first generation to go to college in his family, the first in his family to graduate from college. He was able to carve out a middle class life for himself at a time in America where I think one could do so with even a modest income. My mother was, stay-at-home mom for the first 10 years of my life before she went back to work. And I just want to qualify that because I think that that's sometimes where people get tripped up around our conversations with race, because we think it all comes down to, well, you had your evidence of Black people doing just fine. And if other folks just kind of did what your dad did, then we wouldn't have any of these problems, without recognizing how in many ways he was an anomaly. And therefore, in many ways, even the people I grew up around were anomalies, because they were the ones in their families, in their communities, who were able to get the education that was able to create the conditions for them to be able to raise children in a middle-class environment. And all of them, by and large, were just like my dad and my mom, in the sense that they had grown up working class. My mother grew up working class in Richmond, meaning they lived in homes, but they didn't have their own room. They weren't planning to go to college. Their parents had 8th grade educations. So we were a leap. My generation took a huge leap. And that was in many ways catapulted by policies. And specifically, there were policies, and I write about those that we, have in many ways we have maligned in our society right now, like affirmative action or the civil rights legislation in 1964. My father graduated from Howard 2 months before LBJ signs that law, the civil rights law, and civil rights legislation into law, which then opens the door for my father as a young man in that generation of men and women to be able to access opportunities, often in federal government, because that law in particular applied to federal agencies and also to contractors, anyone contracting with federal government. So him being in DC meant he was surrounded by an infrastructure that was systemically now pivoting towards creating opportunity. So the ways in which a system can pivot to create opportunity, or it can pivot to close off opportunity. And that opportunity can be closed off in such a way that it can manifest systemic racism. Whereas it's not necessarily the case that you will read a piece of legislation or a policy that says, keep Black people out. No, that's not the way it's going to read. But what you will see is that there's an impact that is being disproportionately felt by people who have a shared cultural or even socioeconomic background, such that it would be the case that it is a systemically racist policy. That's why we would call it systemically racist. I use as one example that the Washington v. Davis is a lawsuit. It was a Supreme Court case back in 1976, I want to say, is the year I was. It was set here in Washington, D.C. It stemmed from 2 Black police academy and aspiring police officers here in Washington, D.C. Now, D.C. at that time was already what was called a chocolate city. It was a predominantly Black city, after what we call white flight that really was precipitated as a result of the uprisings following Dr. King's death in 68. You saw massive white flight from Washington, D.C. proper into the surrounding counties. So by the mid-70s, D.C. is considered a predominantly Black city. A point that, so Washington v. Davis, Washington was a guy who felt like, I wanted to be an officer, I want to be a police officer in D.C., but there was a test, and I believe it was called Test 22. And this test asked a series of questions in order for you, and you had to pass the test with a certain grade and a certain score in order to qualify to become a police officer. And what Washington was arguing was that Black applicants for police officer positions in D.C. were disproportionately failing this test. And the police department was like, well, y'all just aren't passing the test. That's just a failing on your part, actually. And Washington argues, no, there are questions on this test that are only going to be known by people who will have certain sets of experiences, right? So he then takes this case all the way up to the Supreme Court. And so there are questions such as, like, there's one, I don't have the questions in front of me and I kind of want to paraphrase them too much, but there are questions to the effect of, like, one's about hunting licenses. Now, who's disproportionately going to know about and have access to a hunting license? And what does that have to do with being a police officer in Washington, D.C.?
I don't think there's a lot of hunting going on.
No, hunting. But there are a variety of questions that have clear cultural implications, meaning if you grow up in a certain environment, and are exposed to certain experiences, you have a higher likelihood of knowing the answer to these questions. And Washington was arguing this. The Supreme Court ultimately sides with the city of Washington, D.C. in saying that the test was not systemically biased, even though disproportionate number of African-American people in an African-American dominant city were not passing the test, and therefore you had a police department that did not reflect the city. So what I suggest is that, and then that particular decision goes on to have a huge impact in our legal system for the next 30, 40 years. It becomes the basis for the ways in which our criminal justice system is able to resist calls from advocates and activists around the systemic bias inherent in it by saying ultimately that a disproportionate impact or disparate impact on a certain community is not in and of itself enough to prove that a particular policy is racist. You need to show intent. Now, we all know how hard it is to show intention. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult. You need to find some document someone has signed or some statement they have made. So it's really impossible. So what I argue is that systemically racist policies typically have an effect that is having a disparate impact on a particular group of people, even though the writing and the letter of the policy might appear to be neutral, because as applied, it has different people from different backgrounds will experience it differently. So that's one way it can show up. It can show up in real estate as well. We see it, and we see it in like home appraisals. Some of the most heartbreaking stuff that I hear is folks who are saying they want to sell, Black folks who want to sell their homes. They feel like they have to scrub their homes of any evidence of its race or the occupant's race in order to get maximum appraisal value. And there's evidence of this happening throughout the country, multiple parts of this country, so that it's not just happening here in Ohio or in Florida. It's happening all over the country. Today, which shows you there's something systemic. If it's the case that a home can be appraised on multiple occasions, and if at one time it has evidence of a Black family there, and another time it has evidence of a white family living there, when the white family is there, or evidence of the white family living there, the appraisal comes in higher, and it's the same house? Come on. What else is that? And that's why I struggle with people. I'm like, what else do you need to see to recognize that this is a real and salient issue? And if you can focus on the fact of its existence, we can focus on how we dismantle it.
And then when you compound this over time, and you have that, by definition, that systemic effect, then you're driving this kind of further down this path, which then makes it much harder to reverse, much harder to interfere with.
Right.
Dax, as transformative leaders and drivers of change, our motivations are often grounded in a set of values or principles. In special operations, on the podcast, in the Talent War Group, our guiding principles, our values, what we call the characteristics of elite performance are drive, resiliency, adaptability, humility, integrity, curiosity, team ability, effective intelligence, and emotional strength. There's 9 of them. You have a core set of beliefs or practices that serve as your guiding principles. What motivates you to wake up every day and continue to push this conversation forward? Those are bravery, community, history, honesty, humility, integrity, and story. There's 7 of them. Mm-hmm. These actually closely correlate to these 9 special operations forces of elite performance. And so if you would, I want to go down this road and I want to dig into the conversation about racial divide through the lens of these values.
Yeah.
Through your values. Tie them into the 9, because this is what we're fighting for. We're fighting to be a values-driven society of people who just want to be good people.
Right.
And do the right thing. The goal of the podcast, create a community of elite performers across all races, all industries. I don't care who you are or what you do. Can you be better tomorrow than you are today? Yourself, your team, your organization, that collectively we drive society forward. That's what we're doing.
Yeah.
But it starts with the values.
That's right.
So let's start with bravery. You've defined bravery as we believe in facing each other, ourselves, and that which divides and discomforts us. We strive to create and hold space so that we can be and remain brave in each other's presence. That's your definition. I call it drive and emotional strength. Okay? Drive, the need for achievement, a growth mindset, be better tomorrow than we are today, continuous self-improvement, to force ourselves to be uncomfortable, because if we're not uncomfortable, we can't grow. Emotional strength, Do we have the courage to remain calm in stressful situations, to push ourselves to act responsibly when we want to turn the other way?
Mm-hmm.
Can we push forward? You said in the book, bear with me, this is a little bit longer one. I understand the layers and divides in a way that gave me insight into the tensions within. I knew how the average privileged white person who sat on boards and led nonprofits had been educated around race. I was educated right alongside them. That education had left out critical context. It led us to falsely believe that racism was a minor problem that had by and large been solved, or that it was just too big and not worth tackling at all. It was important to my own healing that I challenged myself and my clients to be brave with one another. White people, especially white men, are being asked to give up the reins even as they are still being called upon to commit resources, unquote. We've spoken on previous episodes about what we call limiting beliefs, institutionalized thought about societal problems in which a single person stops themselves from action because the problem's too hard. Someone else will solve it. Even if they try, it's not going to make an impact. So focus elsewhere. Do something else. Don't bother. Author Colin Bevan, episode 15, I think, he said, we just have to have the courage. Can you as an individual just have the courage to try? And even if it doesn't go anywhere, what if it does? Can you then look inward and say, at least I tried? And if it does go somewhere, do you then create a movement? Because a movement starts with one person. Can you talk a little bit more about the conversation now? You spoke about some time periods. You referenced some periods in legislation in the past. But today, this is emotionally charged. There's a decision point that we're at in society. You spoke about legislation that set the conditions for the next 30 years.
Yeah.
I think that's where we are now. If we don't do something now, it's going to get left besides. We're going to forget about it. And then where are we going to be in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? So why now? And why in the past have we been so quick to dismiss the conversation, accept the status quo, instead of doing something about it?
I'm reading this book right now. It's powerful, called Unworthy Republic by, I think, Claudio Sant. It's an incredibly detailed, rich, meticulously researched story of the dispossession of Indians, Native folks in the 19th century. And he goes through a painstaking process of really helping you understand how, in particular, the Indian Removal Act, how it was, both came about, how it was executed, and then how systematically the combination of Wall Street and the planter class in the South were able to expropriate and dispossess Native peoples of their lands and then financially benefit from all of that. A key feature of doing that kind of work, which I think is applicable and I think is, of course, in many ways, enslaved Black people were a part of that narrative because they were property that was also being bought in the open market. That money was being facilitated through Wall Street, and it was running through and flowing through these banks through capitalization. So it was a part and parcel. But what fundamentally allows for that to happen are certain beliefs about other human beings. Like, I have to believe and be convinced of the belief of a racial hierarchy in order for me to subjugate other human beings to something I know I would never allow happen to myself or anyone that I love. So in order to dispossess Native peoples of their lands, I have to come up with an entire ideology, an ideology that suggests this land was put here for me to put to use, and these people are not putting it to use. And part and parcel in the way I can do this is by framing them as savages, framing them as uncivilized, right? Likewise, I have to, in order to be able to rationalize a system in which we're going to strip peoples of their family, separate them across the country, whip them, use them as our labor for all manner of things, I have to have an ideology that supports that. Because cognitive dissonance is a real thing. I still need to be able to call myself a Christian. I still need to be able to say I'm a good person and I'm a good member of society, an esteemed member of my community. And so to facilitate that, I have to be able to both believe myself and engage with others of my ilk in a set of beliefs and practices that hold this group of people not only as inferior, but as subhuman. So to me, part of what I'm trying to help folks think about is the extent to which those ideas continue to permeate our culture because they were so foundational. And this is why I think we're seeing these sort of pushback around critical race theory and this desire not to have these conversations. Because when we peel back these layers, we start to see how it was a foundational set of beliefs that were necessary for the building of a republic that we now, in many ways, all of us, I'm sitting here benefiting in many ways from this as well. And the courage and the bravery component I talk about is being able to face that history, to understand that history is it is not just something that happened in episodic way. It was a fundamental feature. Wealth was generated. Generational wealth was generated. At one point, Sant talks about in his book, and I love quoting books that I'm reading at a time because everything's so fresh in my head.
So quoting I'm big on it.
Yeah,
if you haven't noticed.
It's important to do. But I mean, he talks about they were roughly the value of slaves in the South in the early 1830s was about $700 million in dollars and sort of $1830. That's roughly the equivalent of about 20-some billion dollars. And that's just a sort of probably an underestimate. Just thinking about and processing that amount of wealth that was being sort of trafficked, that human trafficking that was taking place. And
But that's a value on a race of people.
For a race of people. And it's still dehumanizing and disgusting and disorienting, but just to give...
But you can't even put a value on a race.
You can't. But I think it's just...
Nor should you.
Nor should you, right? So we could qualify that and we should name that, but that's what was happening. And I think nevertheless, that is still an ethos that still continues to have some penetration and some value in our society, such that you have communities in which are predominantly Black in our culture, in our society. There's a supposition that the land there is less valuable because Black people are there, or brown people are there, or non-white people are there. And when white people come into a community, like into a place like DC, and they returned in the late 90s and 2000s, or gentrification happens, you see property values escalate. And for us to not be able to have a discourse about how that is linked to a history of racial hierarchy, to a history of subjugation, and a history of devaluation of the body of Black folks and brown folks is disingenuous. It's cowardice, because it does not allow us to deconstruct that and reconstruct our society into something that we all would love and I think would allow for us to sort of live into our values more.
Let's talk more about history, which is another one of your values.
Let's do it.
Second one. So you said, quote, "We believe human constructed structures and systems have created barriers and boosts that have held some of us back and propelled others of us forward. We also believe our attitudes and ideas have been shaped by what has and has not happened to us. We strive to visibilize and validate the unseen phenomena that is at play all around us and shaping our shared experience," unquote. All right, so I would call this effective intelligence, applying one's own experience and knowledge to the situation. Our past experiences, they shape our decision-making, they shape our perspective. You said as well, we've been at this crossroads before. White Americans, your parents and grandparents, also watched in horror as cities burned. They also awakened to Black anger and pain and promised to do better. Our entire history is littered with examples of the white power structure responding to Black unrest through actions deemed appropriate and acceptable to the white majority. The options presented by Black people themselves are never seriously considered, unquote. You've referenced President Nixon, President Johnson, affirmative action, multiple Supreme Court cases. We talked about them here. You talked about them and referenced them in the book.
Yeah.
What has history shown us? And have we, I guess more of the question is, have we learned from history anything? Mm. And are we on a path to continue to repeat it?
Listen, let's be clear. Like, my life is a demonstration of, your life is a demonstration of, all of our lives are a demonstration of progress. Is it like progress in the way that we think of like just a pure, like straight line, straight upward trajectory? No, it's jagged. It's a jagged progress. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I would be doing a huge disservice to my ancestors to sit here and say that my life has not been in many ways benefited from and is the result of the struggles of Black folks, of white folks, of folks of Latinx community. Like, there's been struggle that has created the conditions for me to be sitting across from you and you for me to sitting across from me and us having this kind of a conversation. So I just want to name that and be clear. Like, I'm not someone, I would never say that there is not progress. I believe in progress. I believe that we have actually improved in many ways, but I also understand that as a human beings, but specifically in America, we have sort of patterns of behavior. And our patterns of behavior seem to indicate to me, if you look at Reconstruction, even as another example, if we look at when there has been what has been deemed too much progress by Black people, not all white people, but there are members of quote unquote the white race who become very agitated by that, very disturbed by that, because there is a belief that they have that this is their country. And the notion that Black people are getting ahead in some way is really, really disorienting, because it means that in some way in their minds, they're falling behind. I suggest that that's a problem with binary thinking and scarcity mentality, a notion that there's not enough to go around when there's plenty of land, plenty of resources. There's lots enough for everybody, but we still have this notion that there's a limited supply, limited X, Y, and Z. Therefore, we're putting ourselves into this perpetual competition. And as long as that perpetual competition for what are considered these coveted few spots, for whatever they might be, we're going to find ourselves in this oscillating historical trend of forward and backward, because every time we have unrest, which is the unrest leads to moments of conciliation. The conciliation happens for a period of time, and then people feel like, well, we've done enough conciliation. We've given enough to Black people. We've listened to their complaints and their concern. We've given them enough. Now let's get back to business. And that typically means let's reassert hegemony. Let's reassert our authority and our supremacy in some way, shape, or form. And that leads us back into another sort of cycle. So in the 60s, we saw this sort of upswing, which then you sort of follow up with the prison crisis, the mass incarceration. And we see the stripping away of public policies and plans. The Great Society is stripped away bit by bit by bit because there's a framing nationally that the problem is too many people are getting handouts, right? We never have a conversation. We're never able to have a sustained conversation about wealth dispute, wealth inequality, and the need to radically rethink how we distribute wealth in our society. We always sort of have this tendency to focus our attention on these people who are getting some extra crumbs that they have not earned and don't deserve. And that we lose focus. And that loss of focus leads to the backsliding. It leads to backlash. It leads to anger and resentment that then puts us back into this quagmire all over again. And then we find 30 years from now, our kids are going to have there's going to be another social unrest moment. And then they're going to be like looking at us like, what the hell were y'all doing? Why are we here again? Why didn't y'all finish the job? Why didn't you stay focused on what it was? And we're going to be like, because X, Y, and Z happened. I don't know. But like we just have to understand that our tendency as a culture is to lose focus around this issue. And it's largely because, at least in my view, it's because we have still fundamentally not reckoned with how we want to organize ourselves as a society and how we want to understand who we are as not just this nation that is built by and for white people, but has been built by and for many different kinds of people from many different backgrounds. Chinese folks built railroads, you know what I mean? Like, it's who we are. And that's just troubling. And I'll end this by saying this. We just had the census came out. The census results were revealed last week. And it was very disturbing for some people to see that, oh yeah, like the quote unquote white race it's losing ground, if you will, because you have this stark increase in people who identify as Hispanic. You have a stark increase in folks who identify as Asian. You even have an uptick in Black and African-American folks. So as long as we have this notion of us and them, of whose land this is and who founded this place, who built this place, and it's built upon and built against these sort of myths that are inaccurate and just patently untrue, we're going to find ourselves constantly in these sort of struggles.
Well, I think that brings us to community. You've defined community as we believe people in proximity and relationship can solve their own problems. We strive to create and maintain the common ground for genuine community building. That's your definition. I mean, I'm laughing only because this comes up so much, I think, today, because everybody thinks we get so much done and we're so productive when we're on our phones and we're on our computers and we're on our Zoom calls. And when reality is you achieve so much more when you actually sit in the room with a person. I mean, I think we've demonstrated that here today and the day we've spent together, that you just can't replicate when you're just in different places and you're not willing to come together and have a conversation. And this certainly is at the most macro scale. We call it team ability. Mm-hmm. The aggregate is greater than the individual parts. Can we work as a cohesive unit towards this winning goal? Mm-hmm. But it's so as you mentioned, this battle is not going to be won by Black people or white people alone. This has to be won together. It has to be this team that is built and everybody collectively says we're all in it together. And to drive societal and generational change, it's really an all hands on deck approach.
Yeah.
In the context of building community, you've actually cautioned against one societal norm.
Yeah.
Charity. And you're laughing because I know charity is a divisive topic. And I actually agree with you on the fact that it is a divisive topic. Mm-hmm. You said in the book, quote, I learned that charity culture treats the symptoms but not the disease of racism, obscuring the role that policies benefiting the wealthy, tax cuts, tax credits, privatization, and deregulation play in maintaining racial inequality. And the culture does this even as charities themselves exploit entrenched, racialized symbols, stories, and stereotypes to fuel their missions. The annual fundraiser is where it all comes together in what can only describe as an ensemble celebration of white saviorism, no matter how seemingly diverse or inclusive, unquote. Mm-hmm. Can you speak more about the roots of racism versus the symptoms, the mechanisms that we can use to identify these roots and attack it? And then I think we'll agree that charities have a place, but how do we leverage them in the right way?
Yeah. So there's a couple things happening. I think, again, to kind of go back until think about like the 19th century, it is the case that there were leading abolitionists in, say, New York, whose wealth had been built off of the slave trade. It is the case that leading philanthropists of the day and their wives, and sort of men and women, but I'll say at that time, these were wives, the wives who were involved in, any number of charitable endeavors, abolition being one of those, women's suffrage being others. But their husbands were the main ones setting up these companies that were designed to dispossess Native people of their land. And charity kind of fills this gap. It sort of does this work of sort of standing in as a Band-Aid and a sort of balm that's supposed to in some way lessen the suffering that people are experiencing through dispossession, expropriation, violence, and other means of subjugation and oppression. So what I argue about charity, and even from a tax code perspective, charities were set up under the tax code as a means by which to hold and maintain wealth. That's part of what they're able to do. You look at, any number of foundations, and it's part of why you see a lot of wealthy people set up foundations. It's a way to pass on wealth generationally through a minimal tax structure, and you can actually exert tremendous influence through foundations, whether it's the ideas that you value or the issues that you care about. So there's one way to do so. But these are public dollars that have been rerouted into private hands. And we can trace it, at least in the modern day, in our lifetimes, back to the early 1980s when you saw tremendous, a radical, and we should use that word, a radical change to our tax policy such that it created this sort of like a class of wealth that we had never seen in this country before. And that wealth was able to then kind of, and we continue to see, we're able to create a whole infrastructure to execute the ideas that they care about and kind of push the sort of issues that they want to see pushed. And charities begin to pop up more and more and more and more to begin to become the executors of these visions, if you will. These are problems that are societal problems. These are not the problems of individual philanthropists to solve. These are societal problems that we should be solving as a society. That is why you have government. That is the purpose, in my view, of a large government. People might want a small government, but I know there's bureaucracy involved and it's an imperfect structure. I am much less bullish, if you will, on the notion that a venture capitalist or, a hedge fund manager or whatever it is should be the one telling us how our society should be organized and how change should happen. Because what often you find is that people don't really have a deep engagement with how poverty even exists in our country in the first place, that it is in many ways structural. Why do you have so many people living in generational poverty? Meaning that if you are born into poverty, the likelihood is that you will live in poverty, die in poverty, and your children will die in poverty, live and die in poverty. Why is that the case? There's a structural feature to that. Because just as wealth begets wealth, poverty begets poverty. And that has something to do with our policies, our choices, how we fund schools, because we do know our tax code and our tax policies, local taxes, fund schools. And that is a large think about places. I spent a lot of time in New Jersey I went to college there and just seeing how go to one school district to the next or one city to the next, and you can see how tax policy is driving the quality of education. So if we know this, then why haven't we really addressed it? It's because we don't want to. We're fine with it, and we're therefore fine with having charity step in because charity can then make us feel a little bit better about it. We can help a couple of people, but we're not fundamentally changing anything. We can help those that are worthy, like the exceptional Black kid who does really well and who comes to the program that I want him to come to, and we can help that kid. But what about the one who's disaffected and maybe just doesn't really have any belief in or is disengaged from? Well, we can't really do anything with that one, right? But so we're not going to fundamentally address what's happening in that community. We're not going to fundamentally address how that family has been broken or how his parents have never really had opportunities. We're going to sort of be very myopic in our focus on and how we're going to address these things. And so that's why I know that charity does good work. And it's hard for me to be critical of something that I've participated in and know has value in our society. I just think that in many ways, we've set it up as a savior of a problem it's alone to solve, and it needs to be addressed as a societal problem and not be focused on and addressed as a problem of individuals or institutions or philanthropists or foundations. Like, you can't expect them because, and the last thing I'll say on this, if you look at a foundation, most foundations, I mean, the law only requires a foundation to spend, 4% of its corpus on an annual basis? I mean, that's crazy. That just sets up a cycle of perpetuating its own existence rather than actually using the money in its coffers to solve a problem, so that it creates the condition for people to spend as little as possible, 4%. And then it allows you to keep going and moving and sort of existing in perpetuity as if you are solving this larger problem. And I'm like, well, we could decide that you got to spend 50% every year and you've got to go out of business in 10 years. And that's just what it is. And then we'll just have tried to solve the problem, and then we could just go hard and try to do it. But we don't want to do that. We would rather sort of do this small stuff, these little things, and then get into this very celebratory moment when we have one kid or a group of young people who are able to get ahead. Like, that doesn't change the underlying problem. I want to change the underlying problem. I want to change the underlying system that is rigged.
So to identify the underlying problem requires another one of your principal values, honesty, which you've defined as, we believe in truth-telling and seeking. We strive to center our words and actions in those with whom we partner in truthfulness, unquote. We call it integrity. Do what's legal. Do what's right. Be a good person. Tell the truth. You said in the book, if we're going to survive together, you will not be able to decide for everyone else how society shall function. And I believe the only way that you will be able to embrace our new shared reality is if you can come to believe it's best for everyone, including you. I've been in conversation with dozens of white men from different walks who are awakening to the realization that maybe simply not being a racist isn't enough to end racism. These men want deeper insight into not only into how racism has harmed Black people, but, for the first time, into how it has harmed them. They are beginning to see that racism warps us all. The maladies merely manifest differently on the dominant group than the subordinates, unquote. You spoke a little bit earlier, you mentioned the dominant group versus the subordinates. And I think this is an important concept. Can you explain that a little bit more? But then also, how does the perspective of the dominant versus the subordinate affect both sides in the conversation of racism?
Yeah. I credit Beverly Daniel Tatum, she was actually really gracious to do a blurb for my book, for kind of helping me think about the language of dominance and subordinate. She wrote an essay that I often use in my work, and I think I talk about it in the book a little bit as well, around dominance and subordinates. But fundamentally, she gives this really, I think, a really powerful example, how in a classroom, whenever she asks a student to sort of write down their various identities, she notices that white students never identify white as a part of their identity, but students of color will. She'll notice that men are less likely to identify being a man as a part of their identity as women will identify being a woman as a part of their identity. So dominance and subordinates, I think, functions across all of our identities. I hold a number of dominant identities, in fact, right? I'm a man in a society that is a male-oriented, that is a patriarchal society. I am an able-bodied human being in a society that caters to people who are able-bodied, meaning I can move through the world, do all the things I want to do. Like, if there's not an elevator and there's some steps, I'm good. I don't have to worry about those kind of things. Like, there's a lot of that. I am educated. I have a fairly decent education in a society that values education, and those who don't have it are trapped or locked out of opportunity. I could go on and talk about the various identities that I might hold that also give me some dominance in society. But race, being such a central feature of our history, of our experience, is sort of I would argue, probably the main fulcrum through which dominance and subordinates continues to be experienced in our society, such that one who is a member of that group doesn't have to consciously think of themselves as a member of that group to accrue the benefits that are associated with that identity. Like, I don't have to think about being a man and consciously walk through the world as such in order to accrue some of the benefits that are a result of a male-dominant society. When I open my mouth in certain meetings, in certain spaces, people will listen to me differently because I am a man, right? And because it is assumed I have this education, right? Likewise, I think our history is rife with examples of, and we even see, and I'm not to not to do the political thing here, but we saw in our most recent president in our country, who held the office in our highest office in our country, in many ways, had he been a man of a different race, A, he would not have gotten into that position. And I think there's no argument about that. And B, the mere fact of who preceded him, the president who preceded him in Obama, the level of perfection he had to reach in order to be considered a viable option for the same position gives me a clear indication about how dominance and subordinance is experienced through the lens of race in our society. So you asked the second part of the question.
You've actually defined that in the book, too. I think it's an important point that we need to bring up here. You've quoted what you've called the perfect Black man.
Mm-hmm.
Would you define that and kind of just go into that for 1 second? Because I think you bring up a really strong point.
Yeah, I mean, listen, and it's the case, I think, for anybody who's part of this sort of dominant, hegemonic society, the order in our society. If you are not a white man, white cis presenting man, you will more likely are going to need to have a set of credentials that are associated with the sorts of institutions, accolades, and accomplishments that white men typically have in order to be perceived as being equivalent to a white man who may not even have those kinds of credentials. So in the case of when you talk about Obama as an example, and of course, he's an aberration. He is not someone who should be put up as he is an amazing human being who does some amazing things, but to use him as sort of the example of we're doing well, and we know this, I think this trope has been sort of blown out the water, is really problematic because what we're suggesting there is that in order to be considered qualified for this kinds of job that we do not require, we have not required others to have, you need to have these level of credentials, you need to have the right family structure, you need to have the right look, you need to be able to have the right everything has to be right in order for you to get ahead in this society. I was socialized to understand that. I knew growing up that my margin for error was very narrow. I couldn't have sort of blemishes that maybe my white counterparts could have on my record. I had to have a sort of unimpeachable. Now, I resisted that, and I, in many ways, didn't even live up to what that might have looked like. But I do sort of understand that, and that's why I cringe in our society, for instance, when we put so much value on somebody having gone to Harvard or having gone to Yale or having had certain experiences in some think tank or some other institution, because I'm like, what we're implicitly saying is that the only people qualified to hold any power or authority in our society are people who have gone through those particular institutional structures. And anybody who has gotten any different kinds of experience that could actually benefit us as a society is less valued. I mean, there was a statistic done recently in the Biden White House. I think it's there's some 40% of the people there are, Ivy League students, are Ivy League grads. I'm like, why is that the case that our government has to be so highly populated by such a small cadre of people who have such a similar experience? Why don't we open it up? And that's doubly the case or triply the case for people of color, where in order for me to be perceived by you, or not you as an individual, but you as having competence, I need to have a certain I have to have a resume that meets your approval. And by that, I mean, it typically means I have to have gone through the institutions that this society has decided are the most esteemed, elite, and valuable to be associated with. And to me, that's troubling because it suggests that, at least up until this year, if I had chosen to go to Howard or Florida A&M or North Carolina A&T or any Black HBCU, it would be perceived as if I am inferior because I went to an inferior institution. I want to see the day when we have and Stacey Abrams is a perfect example of that. When she's an HBCU grad, we do see a lot of Black leaders, at least in this country at this time, HBCU grads. But I want us to be able to open up our thinking about what our possibilities are, who could be a leader, who could be someone that we could listen to and follow. Doesn't need to be they don't have to all come through the same conveyor belt in order for us to deem them qualified.
Well, there's an argument to be made there, too, about diversity. And in the diversity conversation, people say, well, we have to have diversity. And then they default to, well, we need to have a white population in the office. We have to have a Black population in the office, an Asian population. But they all went to Harvard.
Yeah.
It's okay, great. So everybody looks different, but they all think the same. Right. Have we actually created diversity of thought in this organization when we're all just going to sit here and agree with each other? We just happen to look different.
Yeah, that's why I always argue that we are, any work in the equity space needs to start with the E and not the D. Because equity and inclusion drives diversity. Diversity is an outcome. You get diversity when you create more equity. And creating more equity means you look at your policies and practices and say, are our policies and our practices, those that are implicit or explicit, are they set up only to allow into our community those who maybe not look like us, externally, but have the same experiences as us, right? So if that's why looking at have we created an environment where people who maybe have sort of different norms or whatever else might have you, that they can thrive here as well? Or we created an environment where only people who have have been socialized in a certain way to follow certain structure and rule, they can survive here. And so that's why I suggest that when people want to make change, you don't start with how do we get new people in this room or different color people, different race. It's how do we look at our existing policies, practices, systems, and structures, ask ourselves the hard questions about why we have these, and are these serving us? And do we really want equity? Do we really want difference, or do we just want to have superficial difference so that we can check that box and keep it moving otherwise? Because we don't think there's actually any problem with the way we're doing it.
So we'll back in now to humility here, because this is actually where I wanted to go with the humility piece, right? Which you've said that we believe that no one has all the answers and we strive to listen more than we speak, right? And so we call humility, which is also one of ours in like kind, recognition that we don't have all the answers. We have to be a willing learner. We have to maintain accurate self-awareness, seek others' input and feedback to make educated decisions. So you spoke in the book, in your consulting, as we just mentioned, that you found that in the vast majority of cases, leaders, their intentions were what you called earnest, that they wanted to do the right thing. They wanted to listen to their staff. But when they look around, there are no people of color in the actual organization. So they have to go out and find them. But you also said that the answer to systemic racism is not simply hiring more Black people and then looking at the newly hired Black people and saying, go solve the diversity problem in the organization, right? You said, quote, "We both need to accept that we've failed in moments of great possibility in our past because we began the journey with different agendas," unquote. So my question is, and we've talked about it a little bit here, how do we set the tone for this in the organization, right? Because I would assume it has to come from the top.
Yeah. So I have the benefit of working with a number of organizations, and I see a common challenge that people have is language and misalignment. We might use the same word and have very different meaning for that word because we haven't calibrated collectively in such a way that we are clear about what we're up to. And that is the leader's job. And unfortunately, what I find is that quite often it's the case that leaders are uncomfortable being very clear and direct and careful in their articulation of both the problem they're trying to solve and the commitments they're going to make to the organization in order for them to solve it. Quite often I hear platitudes. I hear very broad statements that can be interpreted in many different ways. I hear sort of a tepid commitment because underlying there's still some reservation around, well, how's this going to play for this community? How's it going to be this? Because they're still leading through sort of a consensus in their mind. And I think that's what we do see a lot of, unfortunately, I don't say a lot of people I've encountered is that there's a sort of assumption that what it means to be the sort of good leader now is to not be the person who makes definitive statements, to not be the person who is like being perceived as having a strong voice. I find leaders have imbibed this belief that I should sort of allow the process to play out. I should defer, give authority over to X, Y, and Z. I'm like, yes, you can do that, but you have to have set the tone already. It's an order of operations. You can't just give over the power or say, I'm going to leave it to the people to do, because what ends up happening is all the people in the middle are confused. And those are all those middle managers. Every organization I go to, middle managers are swimming in, like they're just like drowning, like what? I'm getting messages from below and messages from above, and I don't even know how to reconcile them. If I could just get clarity from what they're trying to say, I could either push it or I could resist it. But right now I'm getting uncertainty. So therefore I'm left to my own devices. I'm going to create my own reality if I have to, if necessary, because I have to survive in this uncertainty. And I do put that on leaders. Like it might be unpopular, as a matter of fact, to say, hey, we're going to focus on this. We're going to move these numbers for the next 5 years, and we're going to keep our attention on it. Some people are going to be upset about it. Some people are going to be like, why are you not focusing on women? Why are you not focusing on this community? You have to be able to have a story for why.
Yeah, I think those are good points. I mean, I think that you do see that a lot in these situations where what you called it stepping up.
Yeah.
Cleo Stiller in episode 7, where we spoke about the Me Too environment, called it stepping up. Can we as leaders in these situations actually look ourselves in the mirror and say, I have to actually take a stand here. I'm not going to be able to sit on the fence, because you do also run the risk, I think, of becoming inauthentic at that point as well.
But I would say this, though. I think what I am encountering is that what has allowed a lot of, so not a lot, because I shouldn't say this at all, because I've met some amazing leaders and worked with some amazing leaders. Some people have risen into their positions of authority, A, without this as a competence, without really having any competency in the area of cultural awareness. But then B, some people have risen by not waking waves. And what I find, which is really kind of unsettling, I've experienced. So I've had an opportunity to work with some senior leadership teams, and this is definitely not the case in all instances, so I've had some really strong experiences. But I have watched really bad actor CEOs make really aggressively ignorant statements, and their second, third, and all those people, and they're all their senior, and just sit there. I've watched them make very insensitive statements, and I'm like, oh, this is how you get ahead here. You get ahead in this environment, and these people are in these senior positions because they have not made waves. And they know that it's too much of a risk to challenge leadership, even if it's done tactfully and done in a way that can be respectful, so that I'm going to just be quiet. And that's the culture here. And that's a problem, especially when it comes to issues around diversity, and especially when we come to issues around race, because I think what I encounter is that a lot of leaders I've encountered still harbor an underlying belief that systemic racism is not really the issue, that it is actually a competence issue, that Black people aren't smart enough, don't work hard enough, have not tried hard enough, and that's the problem. And that efforts that are designed to address past harm are actually efforts that are going to lower quality or create tokenization. And until we get people to be, again, brave and honest about what your actual feelings are, what you really believe, we're going to find ourselves in these sort of superficial spaces where you have lots of employees saying the DEI efforts are a failure, they're a waste of time, they don't really do anything, why are we bothering? It's self-fulfilling. If you've never really committed, and if you begin the journey believing that there's not really a problem to solve, and you're only doing it because the culture out there is so woke and I have to do this now, so let me just do it. If that's your starting point, then of course you're going to see failure. Of course you're not going to move the needle. But if you believe like there has been some deep harm that's been done in this country, and it's inescapable, unavoidable, and undeniable, and even if I don't fully understand how it's happened, I'm committed to making sure it's not happening here. Even if that means I have to listen to people I've not listened to in the past, take some leadership from people who might have more insight into these issues than I do, I'm willing to do that. And I've met some leaders who are that way too. And it's really exciting to be in those rooms with those people because it's like, wow, he gets it. They're going to be all right.
Well, I think you open the door to the next value, which you're calling inquiry, right? We would call it curiosity. And this belief that the only way to get answers is by asking questions. You know, we call it questioning the status quo in pursuit of better. We have to have continuous growth attitude. We've got to learn more. If you're a leader and you have to build this program, as you said, you have to listen to everyone. But the only way you become an authentic listener is to actually have a genuine interest in what you're trying to find out, right? If you don't care, you're never going to get there, right? As you identified. And you have framed this and you've thrown out a lot of questions, which you've referenced, and I would agree with you, are difficult questions to ask as a leader in an organization trying to develop a program like this. And it starts with something like, as you phrased it, does the policy protect rights that Black people were unable to access because of racism? Does it preserve privileges that were only available to certain groups of people based on their racial classification? But then you've taken it a step further, and you said we have to ask ourselves questions, and we have to look inward and think about our beliefs. Where and when were they formed? What happened? Who was involved? Was I a bystander? Was I a victim? Was I the perpetrator? Was I silent? Did I turn away? What did I learn in that instance? Did I learn anything? Did I stop to think about it? Who was involved? So there's these questions that you're drawing out of people in these instances, and whether they be the CEO who makes the off-color remark and everybody else sits there, your challenge to them is, number one, show integrity and honesty.
Mm.
Is that right? Number two, ask the question.
Yeah.
Why am I sitting here just accepting this?
Right. Why is this okay?
So how do we change that? How do we change that second level, right? That mid-management, that person in line to be the CEO who thinks if I don't tell him he's wrong, he or she is wrong, then I'm going to get fired.
Right. There's got to be some incentives associated with it too. What are the, like, people are motivated by, about risk and reward. They're motivated in that way. So we have to tap into that and incentivize people to push, to challenge. We have to teach people how to do it in a way that is tactful, that is productive, and in a way that's going to keep the conversation going. And I think one of the things people have maybe responded to about my approach is that it feels like they could still, even though the book is hard and pushes and challenges, it doesn't feel like I hope it doesn't feel like it's self-righteous. And I think part of the why behind that is that I offer my own experience as a way to demonstrate vulnerability. And I think that that's the key right there. So part of the question, the inquiry process and project and practice that I'm getting at is leaders, I think, traditionally been trained to be stoic, to be sort of opaque, to not really offer too much of themselves, because then that creates vulnerability, that vulnerability can be used against you, and that might demonstrate weakness. Like all these, if we think about them, there's like a lot of male-identified norms and values that are infused our notions of what leadership looks like.
The man box. It's called the man box.
The man box.
Yeah, Cleo Stiller called it the man box. I have to be tough, I can't show emotion, right?
All that stuff. It's being obvious. I think at this point what's exciting is that I think that's being challenged. And I think we're seeing people who recognize that vulnerability is actually a strength and an asset. And actually, you and I were talking before the show about younger folks, Generation Z, millennials. I think that's an expectation that people have of their leaders. Like, I want to know who you are, know who you really are. And not so I necessarily can use it against you, because I want to make sure I want to connect with. And I feel like if I look at the leaders that I've admired, connected to, or, aspired to in some way emulated, it's of course how they respond under pressure. Yes, it's all those things that, I think are valuable, leadership expressions and manifestations of leadership. But a lot of it also is vulnerability. Like, how can you say I'm wrong? Can you say I got that wrong? I missed that one right there. Or like acknowledge somebody else when they're right, when they make an excellent point. Can you lift people up, in a way that might even actually mean that you get knocked down a peg? I just think that all those things are such essential features for us as we face. And I know we're not having this conversation right now. We look at our climate crisis. We look at sort of the COVID crisis. We look at our racial justice crisis. We look at all these things are going to need to be dealt with through the lens, through vulnerability, the ability to sort of, of course, obviously express empathy and demonstrate model empathy, but can you tell a story about yourself as part of this journey, as part of this work? I don't want to just hear about your successes. I don't think that's actually what people want to hear. I can read that in a biography. What I want to know is how you navigated the things that were your shortcomings, how you built against those.
Well, story is your last value.
Yeah.
And you said that you believe everyone has a story. Once we bear witness to that story, then it creates a bond. And I agree with you. I love telling stories. That's why I think it's probably why I wanted to do this podcast.
Yeah.
I would tie in here from the perspective of the 9 characteristics of elite performance: adaptability and resilience. In your story, it's what creates you, and there has to be a reaction and a change to the changing dynamics of a situation, but then also perseverance in the face of challenges, as you talked about. You talked about a lot of different stories in the book. You mentioned some of them here. There's a story you tell in the book about you being arrested after your friend did a pull-up on a piece of scaffolding, which was, I believe, for you, a defining moment.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you would be willing to briefly share that story and what that really brought to light for you about this argument of systemic racism, because it shaped you, but then also not only yourself, because you handled it one way. And I'm not telling the story here because it's your story and you deserve to tell it. And I think it should be told by you. But your friend's life went drastically different because he pursued a different direction than you did. So I'm wondering if you can tell it really quick and kind of give that synopsis.
I mean, it's funny because we're not far from where it actually happened. As a matter of fact, man, there's a story I could tell you 200 feet from the building you and I are sitting in right now. When I was 18 years old, that was the first time a cop put a gun to my neck. I just graduated high school, and I was just, being a teenager at a McDonald's that's right across the street, like playing around, hanging out with my buddies, and ended up in a situation where a DC police officer was putting his gun was in my throat. And I trust and believe I was no threat to this person. I had no weapons. I had nothing to do. I won't get into that story, but I would just point out, like, the story in the book is one of, not the only one. But the one in the story is really important because I was in law school at the point in time in which I found myself in jail, found myself in a jail cell for several days. And it was experienced, police abuse, got beat with batons, saw my buddy get beat in broad daylight while people watched. No one did anything, and I don't expect anybody would do anything. I think it was shocking for folks to see this happening in front of their eyes. And I think in many ways, we were just two young black dudes. I was in my 20s, and I'm sure that there was probably some belief in people's minds that we had done something to deserve it. And it was a pull-up that my buddy did on a scaffold that precipitated it. And our unwillingness to get down on our knees and sort of just to submit to unjust authority in that moment. I share that story because it did give me an opportunity, even as I was in law school, to have to be processed through the system. And you see how once one is processed through the system, the moment you're in, you're sort of suffused in uncertainty. You don't know how this process is going to unfold. And you realize how limited sort of your rights are in relationship to law enforcement and the structure that you're operating against. And everything is in many ways organized to support their narrative, their framing of it. So they get to submit, even their ability, they're the ones that get to file the charges. And they can file a charge saying that I initiated this altercation and therefore charge me with assaulting a police officer, in many ways to cover up the fact that we have been abused. And I've done a lot of research on this separate from this, but it is very common for police reports, for arrest reports to have a couple of different charges that are often on there, especially if they're altercations with assaulting police officers. It's always there. So is disorderly conduct or obstruction of justice. Those three, they run in threes, or at least a 2 out of 3. You're always going to see them because that is the way in which the law enforcement industry or the law enforcement sets up its own defense. So now they have a bargaining chip already. They have a bargaining chip to use against you because they can then come to you and say, we're willing to, we can work with you now because we'll lessen this charge, which is a bogus charge anyway. We'll lessen this charge and you're more willing to negotiate against that. But for me, it was from that point going through the jailing system to going to central booking and seeing yourself inside of this huge cage. I mean, literally a cage. I was literally in a cage with 100 and some other dudes who had been in a cage for a couple of days. And I was put into another cage, squished into a cage with like 50 other people, and then you're given this terrible lawyer who doesn't know anything about your case. And then you're like brought before a judge and you're arraigned and then you're thrown back out in the street to just sort of bewildered after days in the darkness. And now your life has been completely radically altered for at least the time being. You got to get a lawyer now. So I got to pay thousands of dollars for this lawyer to defend something I didn't even do, right? And if I didn't have the resources, then I'm up Schitt's Creek at that point. Then you show up to the courthouse and you see, wow, I just see young black men just being cycled through this whole thing, standing outside with judges on the elevators. I'm like, this whole apparatus is the modern day cotton field. This is the modern day cotton field. This is the rice field. This is whatever else. This is whatever field it was a century and a half ago. It is this now. And we need to be very clear that that's what it is. Everybody in that building is getting paid. The guy shining shoes is getting paid off of me being here right now. The clerk who's putting a stamp on the document that's going to have been filed away is getting paid off of this. This is a cyclical thing. So the system, in many ways, and the criminal justice system is the most physical manifestation of the way the systemic oppression operates. It's the most physical And in many ways, so people will argue, well, anybody, that can happen to anybody. And I'm sure it does and it could. But it's the desire and the designs of a police and law enforcement industry or structure that focuses its attention on certain communities and on certain bodies. As I point out in the book, I highly doubt, had 2 of my white classmates been standing on that same corner in Adams Morgan and one of them did a pull-up, a cop would have pulled up to them and said, get down on your knees. And if we're going to be honest with each other, we have to know that would not have happened the same way. And so that's the sort of, the criminal justice system is one system, but the healthcare system also has manifestations. There are a variety of education system has manifestations of these things. These things have vestiges because they were part of how they were formed and developed and created was in many ways built around a notion of who is valuable and who is not. Who are we here to serve and who are we here to extract from? Who are we here to exploit and who are we here to protect? If that was foundational and we have never gone back to restructure the thing, then even if it's not explicit now, it's still finding a way to weave itself in there and live inside of sort of the expression of the thing. How can people sit on if we were 2 white guys, would people have been going out to dinner just stood there and I watched people walk by and not even pay attention to my buddy getting beat in the street corner. There's a numbing that happens to us around violence to black bodies. And that's when I say the harm goes both ways. That is, if you can walk by or see black pain and people or violence against a black body and your brain goes to what did they do wrong, then you need to check yourself and understand that maybe something that is an unhealthy response to someone who is suffering to ask what they did wrong to deserve that. If you automatically go to and you're side with the people who already have the state authority behind them, who already have a license to operate a weapon, who already have an entire infrastructure to support their narrative, if you automatically go to their side every single time and you never consider that there might be counter narratives here that we need to take into consideration, then maybe you have a warped idea and sense of how society actually operates. And it's unfathomable to me because I've had to live in this body all of my life and had to therefore develop some way to make sense of it all. Because if I didn't develop a way to make sense of it all, I would go crazy, or I would believe what's put out there for me to believe about myself. We have to create counter narratives. For me, that was the experience. I was very thoughtful about writing about that one, because what I don't want to engage in what is called like this idea of the sort of reproduction of Black violence and Black pain. I don't want to engage this very pornographic idea of how we see Black pain in our public sphere. I didn't want to, but I thought that there was something instructive. And as you pointed out, my best friend at the time, he and I go through this exact same experience together. And I make a decision ultimately that I'm going to cop this plea, if you will, if I have to be really honest about it. And that because I'm getting offered, what is an opportunity to get back to my life. And my buddy decides that he's not going to do that. And he's going to fight this thing. And I unfortunately watch, and I can say it's causation, but I saw a correlation between his fight and a mental deterioration that he never fully recovered from. And it's heartbreaking because he's a genius. And he was the purest, decent, one of the best human beings I've ever known in my life. And to watch that experience strip away something so fundamental to him that he could never regain again. And yeah, you could say he should just bounce back from it, but everybody can't just bounce back from these kinds of things. It's not fair to just say people, they should just get over it and bounce back and figure it out. Well, you do it. You bounce back. You have yourself beaten into an alley and you have your right stripped from you and not in a snap of a finger and told now you have to cycle through a system and you bounce back and think everything's okay. Not everybody can do that. I was fortunate enough that I had family. I had like whatever those things that allowed me to do it. But even as I sit here talking to you, I still get sweat under my arms because I'm still back on that street corner. I can still feel it, see it, and know that it was a real thing that happened in my life.
Yeah, and it affects you. It shapes you. I'm glad you told the story, and thank you for sharing it here. I can see it in you and the emotion that it brings.
And just what I want to share is I remember writing a story about that experience, sending it to every newspaper, everybody, and nobody gave a damn. And now how heartbreaking that was, I was like, nobody. I sent it to every newspaper. I thought maybe because I was a law student, no one cared. No one, not a callback, not a write back, not nothing. So when I see all this hand-wringing now about all of it, I'm like, yeah, but newsrooms, journalism, they didn't care for a long time when people were telling these stories because we were numb to it. No one thought it was a story.
This episode is brought to you by Analytics. Whatever industry you're in, Analytics has a group of experts with experience bringing efficiency, transparency, and analysis to your business performance. This includes franchises, restaurants, hotels and hospitality, professional services, e-commerce, startups, and retail. People and collaboration are two of the most important factors in running a successful company. Whether it's private label service, collaboration, or direct engagement with your customers, Analytics can be involved in your client relationships, or they can complete all that other stuff and let you take the credit for it. Visit analytics.com for more information. That's ANALYTIX.com.
So where do we go from here? I mean,
Here we go. That's what the big stuff.
We got to go. We got to start this process of internalization, right? We as leaders of organizations, have to make change, but we can't just hand wave it. We can't check the box. We can't say, oh yeah, I instituted a DEI program, and everybody took the 20-minute online training that they just clicked through and they passed the 10-question test. And now everybody in my organization knows what racial profiling is. So, we're good to go.
Yeah.
You use a framework in your consulting practice that you've highlighted called LENS. Listen, empathize, notice, speak. Can you talk about this framework for a minute? Because I think this is what sets you apart from others, and it also really drives you got to put it one step in front of the other on this thing. It has to be meaningful.
It does. Yeah. I think our tendency in this country is to start with speaking. We see people talking all the time and don't know what they're talking about. All the time. I'm like, you haven't done I've had people critique my work. I'm like, you haven't even read the book. So what are you talking about? You haven't cracked it. The book before it even came out, I had people like, how would this guy, you're just depending on this old, I was like, damn, you haven't even read it. How do you have this strong of an opinion about it? So I think there's an intentionality in the same way I structured the book so that there's a section about harm, heal, and then act, because I think we want to go to action right away. So companies that want to just act right away, well, ready to go, ready to do it. Well, why weren't you ready a year ago? So what makes you ready now? Because you say you're ready now, you're ready? So that's why I start with what kind of learning have you done? What kind of listening have you done? And listening it can happen and manifest in a number of ways. Because I am of a belief that the listening, it does begin to help us connect with the empathy that's going to be necessary to do this work. Empathy is such a critical component to leadership, but also specifically to being able to engage with narratives and experiences that may not correlate with our narratives and our experiences. And I think that when we start to do a little bit more history, learning, hearing, the empathy, sort of the instinct for empathy, whatever you might call it, kicks in. And then at that point, I go to this, what we call the noticing and the naming. If it is the case that you find whenever a conversation around race begins, you either find your body pushing back, you find yourself getting uncomfortable, you find yourself getting nervous, I want people to use that as data because that's valuable. Like that's not a bad thing that's your body telling you something. And so you need to investigate at that point, once you've done some learning and some empathy, what is going on there? Well, am I defensive when certain people talk or share their experiences? Do I shut down? Do I disengage when certain conversations? Why? Is it because maybe I just don't have the answers or this feels out of my element or I don't have what I need? Well, then say that. Say that. Don't just walk out the room. Don't just click off the Zoom, right? Because now that you're at least naming and you're giving me some data that we can work with, right? And then that's why I say the speak is the last, because at that point, you're ready to say whatever it might be. It might be that I don't have the answer. Help me understand more. I'm feeling this way right now, and I don't like the way I'm feeling. So I'm going to be clear and honest. One of the best conversations I've had was with a white man. It's a little bit older than me. And he and I had a conversation, and he said to me one day, he's like, Dax, I'm going to be really honest with you. I'm struggling with all this DEI stuff. I feel like in many ways, it is everywhere I look. And as a white man right now, I feel like all the work that I've done, the excellence that I've achieved and all that is being in many ways thrown out. All of my career accomplishments all of a sudden don't matter anymore because I'm not, quote unquote, as woke as I need to be. And I resent that. And I said, thank you, man. Thank you for saying that because you're a human being and if that's a feeling you're having, that's a legitimate feeling you're having, right? That's a legitimate experience that you're having right now. And I want you to work with that because what you're experiencing right now is akin to what people have been experiencing for hundreds of years. Their narratives don't get heard. They feel excluded. They feel like no one cares about what they've accomplished. That is what we're talking about. So you can now actually use that resentment, use that feeling that you have, not to push back or fight, but to make some better connections with people who might have been having that same experience for generations. And now they understand, well, what they want to be included too. They want to be heard too. They want to be able to have X, Y, and Z as well. We don't actually have difference in terms of aspiration here, right? But it can only happen because he decided that he was going to trust me and we were going to trust each other. Because I was sharing with him, we were going to trust each other enough to be vulnerable and allow that vulnerability to let us express what we actually feel, what we're actually wrestling with. Not what I want to hear. We're not what Dax wants to hear. Because it's not serving me to have you tell me what you think I want to hear and then go out and just do whatever. Mm-hmm. I'd rather you tell me, Dax, I disagree, and here's why, so we could talk about it, than just nod and say, well, the culture says I have to say I agree now, so I'm going to just say I agree, even though my heart doesn't, even though I have reservations about this. That's why it's hard. And you might get some things wrong. I get things wrong. You might lose some friends, but you might gain a lot of friends too. And I think we focus a lot on, in these conversations, what am I going to lose? Whether it's credibility, whether it's authority, whether it's whatever, versus what we can gain, which is maybe people, you never know who might hear you struggle with something, struggle to articulate and be like, oh, I see you now and I got your back now because I see you struggling with me versus trying to hold on to this posture of certainty when none of us have that right now.
Even if they might not even agree with everything.
Even if they might not agree.
We would say that all the time in the military, is that your bond and your unity is a common mission and vision. And this is one of those topics where if we're aligned to reach the same end goal, and we sit here and we may have different views at times of how we're going to get there, but we know that we're committed to get to the same place, we stand up for each other. We help each other. In the military, we say, I'd lay my life on the line for a guy that I didn't even like, but I knew that when he was in the fight, he was there to say, and he'd do the same thing for me because we had the same goal. Dax, this is a hard conversation, and I appreciate your openness, your honesty, your willingness to sit here with me. I think that this is a critical conversation. The points, everything we've discussed here helps us to become better individuals, teams, organizations, drive societal change in terms of the race conversation. But a lot of what you talk about too applies to leadership. And how do we challenge ourselves as leaders to have difficult conversations and sit here and, in a sense, get in the room, talk about it, and do it. And so as we wrap this up, I want to have a little bit of fun.
Yeah.
Okay. I've had a lot of fun here. Don't get me wrong. But some of the points you made in the book directly to what I want to call Dax's decision points. All right. And they're these stepping stones in a leader's thought process to solve a very complex, maybe emotionally charged problem. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw them out. You come back to me and you tell us what that means in, that 2 to 3 lines, top line.
I love it.
All right. So the first one's get a grip.
Yeah. People short circuit very easily and lose sight of the fact that, A, this isn't always about you personally. This is about a we, and it's about a larger set of challenges we face as a society. So don't personalize everything. Don't think it's all about you. So get a grip.
Buckle up.
We're going to be on this ride for a while, right? Like, don't try to get off the ride so quickly. Don't and I think that's a struggle we have as a society. Like, it's been with us for 400 years as a problem. Why do you think you get to solve it in 6 months?
Look back on your life.
Our lives are data. If you look back, there's probably been moments in either you passed over certain information, didn't engage with certain conversations, maybe didn't do some of the learning that could be really useful right now, or there might be different kind of experiences in your background. But we are, I believe at least, we are in many ways sort of a set of experiences that we've had, good, bad, or indifferent. So look back and use that as an opportunity to figure out how you became who you became.
Resist the urge to turn away.
Yeah, it's connected to the buckle up, but I think that I see it a lot in leaders. It's like there's this desire to open up the conversation or to change it to this and move it. Like, stay here and stay with it. It might feel like it's not moving, but you just got to stick with the thing that we're talking about right here, because we've been talking about it for a long time. We've made some progress too, but the turning away feels like the easy thing to always do.
Which ties into the next one of resist distraction.
Yeah. It's going to happen, especially if you're a leader, an organizational leader. You're going to have any number of fires that you're being called upon to put out. And knowing which ones are legitimate uses of your times and cognitive bandwidth and which are not. This is something that for some people is so central to their identity, but for other people, it's so not central to their identity that that finding things to invest yourself in that are not this work is very easy to do. And quite often, especially if it's the bottom line. If you got bottom line issues you're dealing with, then you're very easy to dispense of any conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, because they seem to be sort of noise, if you will, that are the distractions from the thing we're really trying to do here. And I'm arguing that they are one and the same. In 2021, they are one and the same. They're connected.
Focus on the top line issue. In the book, you said focus on race, and you brought it up here, but put that focus on the top line issue.
Yeah. I argue in the book, if we look at our history, the moments when we've focused, specifically if we talk about race, and we've done focused work, we've created and done remarkable things. So that focus actually, whether it was the 14th Amendment, civil rights legislation, by focusing very specifically on race, we were able to solve for a number of challenges. Equal to the Equal Protections Law, equal protection does not just apply to Black people, it applies to white people too. Civil rights legislation doesn't just apply to Black people, it applies to women, it applies to people with disabilities, it applies to people in the LGBT community. It's it actually solves a lot of problems, or at least addresses a lot of the problems, but it only happened because we decided to focus on the issue at hand.
Which brings to the next one, which is focus on the impact.
A lot of times people get struck and struggle with what my intention was and what I meant was, and I didn't mean to, and not deal with this is how it was experienced and felt by the person on the other end of it. That means letting go of whatever you thought you were trying to achieve as the measure by which you're going to, or the measure you're going to use, and look at how is it being experienced. We started this conversation talking about Washington v. Davis and racial discrimination laws and how the Supreme Court has made it the law of the land that intention needed to be found or needed to be evidence of intention in order for there to be a finding of discrimination. that was a bad decision. That was a wrong decision. It led us down a bad path. We need to be able to focus on impact and how different groups might be feeling and impacted by a decision and use that to reverse engineer what we want to create.
Share the power.
It's the hardest thing to do. You know, in a hierarchical society such as ours, in many ways, I mean, you came out of the military. The military has been, in many ways, it has given us some of the fundamental structures and tools that we've used and have been adopted in business and have been adopted across many organizations. Hierarchy serves well in war. It's really effective in leading in that kind of a way, absolutely. But we're not always in that kind of a situation. So we need to come up with different decision-making structures. And then we've seen it, as a matter of fact, and there are other forms of engaging in warfare. We see it in our engagements across the globe. We have nodes. We have smaller groups of people who operate more autonomously, set of values that they have that are shared, but they actually they're more self-propelling. We need to have more of that. And that's what sharing of the power looks like. Decision-making can't only live with single individuals who have historically had it. We have to disperse decision-making because that's where inequity is most saliently expressed and felt and manifests.
I'll call this next one, don't expect the affected to solve your problem.
Yeah.
In terms of the race conversation you said, don't expect Black people to be the savior.
Yeah. You know, I think that sometimes as I look at a lot of the hiring that's happening for, diversity positions, I'm going to say it and know it's going to be probably unpopular to say, like, just because you have a Black person or a person of color working in your company who seems to like have some facility with cultural issues and whatever else have you, doesn't mean that they are ready to be and should be appointed as a DEI expert. This actually is a practice that those of us who engage in it and spend deep time and have done deep work around it have developed our own pedagogy with respect to. And so it's not a fair expectation that just because someone seems like they're with it or have a finger on the pulse, they should therefore be placed in a position now to oversee this larger enterprise that has implications for everybody, not just your people of color, which is really critical. DEI, diversity work, and even those of us who use the idea of diverse candidate, I want to ask you, stop using the word diverse candidate. Like, what do we mean when we're saying diverse? Are you saying non-white? Like, what do you mean when you say diverse? Like, I'm not a diverse candidate. I'm a Black man, but I'm not a diverse candidate. That's a weird terminology in the use of the language. So it's just to suggest that when we're asking people to do this work, we put a lot of pressure on people who often maybe themselves are learning it and don't know how to do it and have not been necessarily trained in it. So be very thoughtful about who you point to take on that work. Give them the resources they need, but don't expect them to be miracle makers.
All right, last one. Consider stepping down.
I knew you'd make that one last. This is the one that's the hardest. It's the hardest one. It's the hardest one. It's the hardest one because I say that in any organizational structure, there are a set of competencies that are expected that our CEO or leader or senior leader is expected to have. It is the case that in 2021, it is a competency that you are expected to have at this point. It is not just like you have to be able to read a budget, manage people, X, Y, and Z. This is a competency. And if you are either unwilling to develop that competency or don't believe that it is necessary to do so, then maybe you should think about this is not maybe the place for you to be. And it sounds harsh and it sounds cruel, but again, focusing on impact. You not deciding to learn, upskill, or build the capacity is going to have a harmful impact on people who are depending on you or people in your position to be thinking about them and their experience in the workplace. We expect people, we want people to come back to the office. We want them to love our cultures. We want them to be dedicated to our companies. Well, this is part of it then. You dedicate yourself to learning these issues, learning to understand our history, engaging yourself and candidly being able to talk about issues of race or whatever else have you. If you want me to love and be all about the culture and stay here for 20 years and give my blood, sweat, and tears, what are you doing? What's your work?
Dax, as we close every episode, I'm going to ask you about 3 things that you do every day to be successful. The Jedburghs in World War II had 3 foundational core skills. They had to shoot, they had to move, they had to communicate. If they did these 3 things to a level of excellence and perfection every day, it didn't matter what challenges came their way because they could divert their energy to solve the challenge in front of them. What are the 3 things that you do every day to be successful?
Yeah, I love on my family. I have beautiful children, beautiful wife, beautiful mother, mother-in-law, sisters, brothers. I love my family and that's how I start my day. I'm a reflective person by nature. That reflection often takes place in nature or it takes place in sort of through meditation, but I set aside time for deep reflection, whether it's on immediate things that are going on or just some of the past things in my life. And I love the word move because I'm an athlete. I'm a physical being in the world, and I've learned so much through movement, through engagement in team, through engagement with others, through sport, through physical activity. And it's always had such a powerful impact on helping me develop relationships. So I always say that. So, a movement is a critical component of my day, always. It needs to be.
Love the family, reflect, movement.
Sure.
I like it.
I love it.
At the end of every episode, Dax, I take the 9 characteristics of elite performance: drive, resiliency, adaptability, humility, integrity, curiosity, team ability, effective intelligence, and emotional strength. And I apply one of them to the guest. And I say that in order to be an elite performer, you have to demonstrate all 9 of these. And you normally demonstrate a couple of them at any one time, rarely all 9.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to do something that I don't normally do. And I'm going to say that I can't assign you one because I have to give you all. Because this conversation, this topic, this divide that sits in our country today is not a black or white problem. It is a societal problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's one that must consume all of us. And in order for us to drive change, we have to exhibit all 9 of these characteristics at the same time. And it doesn't matter how hard it is. And it doesn't matter how uncomfortable it is. And it doesn't matter that it's going to be messy and it's going to suck. And we're going to say the wrong thing every once in a while. But if we commit and we demonstrate the 9, we will say and do the right thing more than we will say and do the wrong thing. And that will change society. Thank you for joining me today. It is about impact. That's what we strive to achieve. It's been a pleasure to be in the room with you.
And thank you so much, Fran. Appreciate you for inviting me on this show, for preparing as you have prepared, for reading so deeply, for spending the time. It's an honor. And I just wish you all the success in the world with the work that you're doing because it's so needed.
Thank you.
American Jedburghs went on to form the foundation of the United States Special Forces and the Special Activities Directorate of the Central Intelligence Agency. Thanks for listening to the Jedburgh Podcast. I'm your host, Fran Racioppi. We're brought to you by the Talent War Group, an executive search firm and talent advisory. We'll drive you to attract, retain, and develop top talent. With services like talent acquisition, leadership development, and keynote speeches, we work with you to create talent solutions to business problems. To get started, visit talentwargroup.com. Join us next week for a new episode of the Jedburgh Podcast on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, and iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you heard, give us a like and leave a review. Follow me, Fran Racioppi, the Talent War Group, and the Jedburgh Podcast on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and send your comments and inquiries to media@talentwargroup.com. As former members of Special Operations Forces, the Jedburgh Podcast and the Talent War Group contribute a percentage of all profits to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation, supporting the families of our fallen warriors. Thanks for joining us on this episode. How you prepare today determines success tomorrow.